A group of friends decided to go on an overnight trip to an old, secluded house up in the hills. It had once been a church, but years ago, it had been converted into a private home by a family who long since moved away. The house sat at the edge of a small village, surrounded by thick, dense woods. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, tall, weathered stone walls with crumbling stained glass windows, now replaced with simple panes. The interior still had remnants of its religious past, high wooden beams, narrow archways, and an atmosphere that felt frozen in time. The day was filled with activities, hiking, games, and a few ghost stories shared by the campfire. As dusk settled in, they gathered around for dinner, laughing and enjoying the rare moment of togetherness. By the time the last rays of light slipped away and darkness filled the room, everyone was exhausted, eager to get to bed. Except for one girl, Clara. The others drifted off almost immediately. It was no surprise. The day had been exhausting. The house was massive, and despite its transformation, it still held the heaviness of its former life. The air was thick and musty, and even with the windows cracked, the heat was stifling. The room was large, with wooden floors that creaked with every movement, the kind of space that seemed to swallow sound. Clara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her body covered in sweat, though she wasn't sure if it was from the heat or from something else. Her eyes flicked to the far side of the room. There was a faint glow coming from a streetlight outside, casting long shadows through the gaps in the old curtains. For a while, she tried to relax, but a strange unease settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something was watching her. The silence in the room felt thick, suffocating. Then came the first sound, a creak, a subtle shift in the floorboards, far off in the distance, maybe in the hallway. She flinched, unsure if it was just the house settling, but it wasn't the usual sounds the building made. It was deliberate. She told herself to breathe. It was nothing. But then, it happened again. This time, closer. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something, moving. Her heart began to race. Who else was awake? But then she remembered, everyone else had fallen asleep. The only person left was her. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she lay still, too afraid to move. Her body felt stiff, heavy, like a weight was pressing down on her chest. She couldn't open her mouth to scream. She couldn't move her hands, not even her legs. It was as if her body had been paralyzed. A cold sweat began to form along her skin, her breaths growing quicker, sharper, panic creeping in. She shut her eyes tightly, trying to calm herself, but it was no use. The footsteps were getting louder, closer now. The sound of them scraping against the wood was unmistakable, deliberate. She could hear them moving slowly, almost as if they were pacing, but always getting nearer. It was coming for her. Her chest tightened. She wanted to cry out, to move, to do something, but she couldn't. She felt like she was trapped inside her own body. The footsteps were right outside her bed now, so close she could almost feel the air shift with each step. What is it? Her mind screamed. What is happening? Her skin tingled with fear, and a strange pressure built in the air, like a storm was about to break. But it wasn't just the sounds of the footsteps that unnerved her. It was the presence. She could feel it, a dark, powerful energy that filled the room. It wasn't just the house, and it wasn't just the night. It was something else. Something old. Something that belonged there. The sound of the footsteps stopped. A chill ran through Clara's body, and she squeezed her eyes shut tighter, her breath ragged in her throat. She felt something move in the room. Something dark. A coldness that seeped into her skin, into her bones. Then, there was a whisper, a voice, faint but clear, coming from the shadows. Clara. Her heart stopped. It was her name. She was sure of it. But it didn't sound like anyone she knew. It wasn't a friendly whisper, or a comforting one. It was low, gravelly, and seemed to echo in her head as much as it did in the room. The voice came again, this time closer. Clara. Her body trembled uncontrollably. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, but she couldn't look. She couldn't see. The presence, whatever it was too powerful. The air felt thick, like it was closing in around her. Then, silence. Her breathing was all she could hear now. Fast, panicked. She tried to move her fingers, her toes, anything, but her body remained unresponsive. She didn't even have the strength to open her mouth, to call out to anyone. The only thing she could do was wait. wait for whatever was in the room to make its next move. And just when she thought she might suffocate under the weight of it all, she heard it again. A tap, like something heavy had been placed down gently on the floor. Then, another tap, and then another, closer, until it was right next to her bed. A voice, softer this time, but unmistakable. Clara. It was the final straw. Her body finally responded, and she gasped, pulling herself up, her hands shaking as she tried to sit up. Her head spun with terror, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, tight. She was trapped in silence, her mind lost in panic. What was it? What just happened? Suddenly, a loud thud from the far side of the room made her jump. It was as if something had fallen, but when Clara turned her head, there was nothing. Nothing but the faint light from the window, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The moment the footsteps stopped, Clara's body finally unlocked. She jumped from the bed, stumbling, and then, she screamed. A raw, strangled sound that echoed through the house. The other girls were up in an instant, rushing to her side. They found her in the middle of the room, drenched in sweat, wide-eyed, and shaking uncontrollably. "What's wrong? What happened?" one of them asked, pulling her close. Clara could only stare at them. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. She was lost, eyes darting around the room as if she was seeing something they couldn't. She pointed shakily toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows lay thick. The others laughed, thinking she had just had a bad dream or a nightmare. But Clara knew. She knew what she'd felt. The weight, the footsteps, the voice. The presence in the room that was still there, even though they couldn't see it. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the girls laughed it off, calling Clara the scaredy cat, teasing her about her overactive imagination. But as they packed up to leave, Clara could feel it again, the strange, heavy air, pressing down on her chest. And when she turned for one last glance at the old church-turned house, she could have sworn she saw something in the window, watching her.